We move on to our next session, Why the Mahatma Matters. Sudhir, Chandra and Vinay Lal will be in conversation with Chandan Gowda. Chandan Gowda is a Ramakrishna Hegde Chair Professor of Decentralization at the Institute for Social and Economic Change. Besides academic publications, he has translated Kannada fiction and non-fiction into English, including, of course, U.R. Ananthamurthy's novella, Bara. Sudhir Chandra is the author of Gandhi, An Impossible Possibility, and editor of Violence and Non-Violence Across Time, Religion, Culture, and History. He's currently engaged with the question of the possibility of non-violence in today's world. And Vinay Lal is a cultural critic, writer, blogger, and professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California. His intellectual and research interests include South Asian history, comparative colonial histories, the politics of knowledge systems, cinema, cultures of sexuality, the global histories of non-violence, and the thought of Mohandas Gandhi. Let's put our hands together and welcome our speakers for this session. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be in conversation with Vinay Lal and Sudhir Chandra, both of whom are, of course, intellectual historians of Gandhi, but if you read them, you'll know that it's more than just a professional relationship. There's an existential side to it, which I've always been deeply moved by. Very quickly, Sudhir, since the panel has been titled, Why the Mahatma Matters, when you look at the broad space of Gandhi work, Gandhi practice, Gandhian thought in the country today, what do you see?
Friends, let me straight away begin by making a confession. While I think that my confession is that I genuinely believe that Gandhi matters a great deal for humankind. Also, that today he matters even more than he did in his lifetime. Having said that, and you may decide not to unclap after I've said this, having said that, I equally genuinely believe that there is very little chance of Gandhi being really put into practice on a large scale. And practicing Gandhi on a large scale is what humankind needs today.
I would agree with what Sudhir has said, but let me add the following. The first is that I am of the view that we should first ask whether Gandhi actually does matter, particularly in this country, because I very much regret to say that a large segment of the Indian middle class has not merely abandoned Gandhi, but in fact has deliberately jettisoned him and created an environment which is a very poisoned environment, which makes it actually very difficult to really get an appreciation of the ideas that Gandhi stood for. Because it is my view that Gandhi is in fact a singular figure in world history in various ways. He's sui generis in various ways. And I do think that as we think about Gandhi, we're going to have to think of him not only as a practitioner of ahimsa and as an exponent of the idea of satya, but we have to take the whole Gandhi. And Gandhi was a person who in many ways was far ahead of his times. So for example, when we think of, let's say, climate change, which to my mind is one of the most pressing issues in the world, I think that Gandhi was actually a thinker of enormous ecological sensitivity. So I think Gandhi always matters. Whether he matters in India is a different question in some respects.
You mentioned the middle classes have abandoned him.
Yeah.
But what about the non-middle classes, the lower below? Because then Gandhi keeps saying he's only articulating what the ordinary Indians are thinking. It is that class he has in mind. So where are they in this?
Well, I think your point is a very germane one, which is one reason why I think we need to hold out some hope. And I think that what happened at Shaheen Bagh, for example, is a wonderful demonstration of how we can take ahead the idea of ahimsa. I thought that was actually one of the most extraordinary movements in the history of post-independent India, and let's remember who it was carried out by. It was led by women, many of whom were semi-literate only, who displayed an extraordinary kind of intuition about how to use Gandhi's ideas. I think that this was a wonderful demonstration of nonviolence. So I wouldn't say that Gandhi doesn't matter for every segment, but certainly I think that if you're looking at the middle class, I think it's a different story in India today.
Even the Sikh farmers' dharna outside, was for a year-long dharna.
Yeah.
In his book, Gandhi, The Impossible Possibility, one of the things that you alert us to is how his ideas of ahimsa underwent a change after the partition happened. The scale of violence he saw made him rethink the notion of ahimsa. Could you say something about that?
See, Vinay is right when he says that Gandhi was ahead of his times. The challenge before us is, shall we ever be, can we ever be contemporaneous with Gandhi? That is the question we have to ask ourselves. I feel that Gandhi is universally needed. India needs Gandhi as much as the rest of the world does. Before coming to this question of non-violence, I'd like to say there's hardly any sphere of life in which the kind of turn that our lives have taken is not such as not to require radical correction. And if our lives need that, life course needs that kind of a radical correction, then Gandhi, among others, is the person we have to remember. Now, this question of non-violence, see, unfortunately, there has been a valorization of Gandhi for wrong reasons. The primary reason why we still continue to valorize Gandhi is that Gandhi for us is a moral asset. Gandhi enables us to tell the entire world that we have been unique, or that we were unique in showing a way to the world, the way of non-violence. That we made it possible for that mighty British Empire to live through the instrument, through the weapon of non-violence. This is a great moral asset, and we do not want to part with it. Somewhere it eases our conscience, and that moral capital we are not ready to part with. But what is the reality of non-violence in Gandhi's life, in India's life, and in our lives? When I was reading Gandhi's Prarthana Pravachans, his prayer discourses, from April 1947 to 29th of January 1948, I was struck by an extraordinary confession that Gandhi made. He said that for 32 years, or almost 32 years, after his return from South Africa, he believed that the country had followed the path of satyagraha, that is non-violence. But when on the eve of partition, such brutal violence broke out in the country, he started asking himself a simple question. The question was, how come that a people who had been following non-violence for 30 years could overnight take to this kind of violence? He reflected and came to a startling conclusion, which I wish to share with you. He came to the conclusion that what he believed what people believed and what the world believed to be non-violence was not non-violence. What India had followed was not satyagraha, which is the violence of, satyagraha is the non-violence of the brave. Of the brave. What,
brave, yes.
what India during his leadership had followed was passive resistance, nishkriya pratirodh. And nishkriya pratirodh, he said, is the non-violence of the weak. And he went on to say that the non-violence of the weak is actually a preparation for violence. He said, we realized that there is no chance of our violence succeeding against the British. And he used a remarkable quote from Annie Besant. He said, and I'll say it in Hindi, and one of you can translate it. He said, Bakol Annie Besant, according to Annie Besant, Rode ka jawab, a pebble, if you throw a pebble on the British, pebble is roda. Rode ka jawab, goli se milega. You throw a pebble and you'll get a bullet in return. And because of that, he said, Gandhi ka sikka chali gaya. Gandhi came into currency because of this. And he also added that if we had known the art of atom bomb, no one would have heeded me. And then he went on to explain that the non-violence of the weak is, like I said, is a preparation for violence. And why? He said, the violence which we had kept repressed inside us, at the first opportunity, came out. And if you remember your Freud has given us a remarkable idea, the revenge of the repressed. You repress something, and sooner or later, before you have realized what has happened, that repressed will take its revenge on you. So this pratishodh, he used the word pratishodh. This is what our non-violence all along was, and now I can see that the country has to prepare once again for non-violence. Let alone non-violence, Gandhi Satyagraha, we are not even ready to follow his Nishkriya Pratirodh.
Thank you, Sudhir. Sudhir called Gandhi a moral asset. So how do you see this asset being awakened against contemporary evil? I mean, what are the ways in which you can see it happen, Vinay?
Well, let me get to that in a slightly different. Yeah, let me get to that in a slightly different way. There's an American philosopher of religion who passed away a couple of years ago. His name was James Carse. And he wrote an extraordinary book called Finite and Infinite Games. Now, in Carse's language, Mohandas Gandhi was a player of infinite games, right? And you'll see how I'm addressing that question, because I think that, you see, the moral universe that we inhabit is increasingly a universe where everything has been instrumentalized, where there are outcomes. There's winners and there are losers. Now, Mohandas Gandhi did not play in that language. So even, for example, when we think of, let's say, a contest between nations, we think of a battle, we think of a war, we think about who won, who got defeated. Gandhi never uses that language. Because one of the things that he understood was that victory is at least as catastrophic for the victors as defeat is for the defeated. All right? And in my view, when we think about Gandhi's moral universe and how we can make him actually morally imaginative for ourselves, I think we would have to enter a very different kind of universe. It's not a universe of known outcomes. It's not a universe where there are clear winners and losers. It's not a universe where, in fact, one actually does things in order to attain certain kinds of ends. And I have to say, I agree entirely with what Sudhir has said. For example, even on the question of nonviolence, I will speak in just a moment about one particular incident which is usually viewed as one of Gandhi's weaker moments. In my view, it was one of the most majestic moments in his life. And I'm referring to what happened at Chauri Chaura, or rather, what I might say, Gandhi's decision to actually call off the non-cooperation movement in the face of virtually unanimous opposition from the entire Congress. Because, you know, for those of us who know the history of India at that time, we know that there were parts of British administration that had been paralyzed. At this point in time, in early 1922, the non-cooperation movement had been a spectacular success in many ways. And then this incident takes place at Chauri Chaura, and Gandhi decides that he's going to actually suspend the whole non-cooperation movement. And he was criticized roundly by everyone, including his closest followers and disciples in the Congress. And I think that this speaks to Sudhir's point, because for Gandhi, non-violence was never simply a matter of a policy. Non-violence is a way of being in the world. It's a way of actually being in the world. And that requires a very different comprehension of what Gandhi was really attempting to do. And so I think if we actually look at some of these moments in Gandhi's life, they take on a very different hue and color, because what they do is they, in a sense, really instruct us about the nature of moral reasoning, which I think is becoming increasingly difficult in our times.
Again, to go back to this question of fashioning a politics that is regenerative for the present. I mean, if fascism is something, if fascism is something that everyone is concerned about, and if Gandhi can be seen as an anti-fascist thinker, what ways do you see, recovering resources from the Gandhian tradition to fashion an anti-fascist politics?
When you think of Gandhi and when you talk about Gandhi, you have to think of basics. Gandhi's answer would be, to this question, would be very simple. Say no. Learn to say no. Have the courage to say no. And you have the courage, and also, if you have the courage to say no, because you think that your no is the right no, then you should not worry about who comes with you and who does not. Now, this may sound utopian, but this is the only way out, the only way possible. If each one of us is ready to say no and act upon our no, see what kind of a change would come about. As for the possibility of that no being said, let me reiterate what I began with. In a country where a great soul can be killed inside our jails and no one comes out on the road, can you think of a greater moment of shame for a people than that? You know whose death I'm talking about. So, this question everyone has to ask this question of themselves. It is not for a Gandhi or a Vinay or Chandan or me to say this. Ask yourself what you can do, what you ought to do, and the rest would follow.
Thank you, Sudhir. Vinay, do you want to engage that question?
Could you frame it again?
Yeah, I mean, again, for fashioning an anti-fascist politics,
Yes.
how can Gandhi be enabling?
Well, some of the things that Sudhir has said, I would certainly say the courage to say no, as he said. But to forge an anti-fascist politics, I mean, I think that there are a number of considerations here. The first is that, and I think that this is partly what Sudhir is hinting at as well, that, look, I mean, I think the fascist is always outside us. The first thing, of course, is to look within ourselves. You see? It's always the other. And it seems to me that in almost every political system that we have, there are elements which are conducive to a certain kind of fascism. So one can take it first at the meta level, one can take it at the political level, one can take it at the level of political institutions, and this would mean addressing certain questions about what is the nature of citizenship, how does one actually carry out one's duties as a citizen. Because recall also, right, that, you know, if you look at Gandhi's huge oeuvre, he almost never speaks of rights. He speaks of duties. But there is a real problem in trying to advance a language of duties, because if you tell people who've been oppressed historically for a long period of time that you have to think about your duties, they'll say, yeah, that's all we've been told for generations, right? So when we think about how we're going to forge an anti-fascist politics, I think what we would have to do is we would have to first, once we move beyond the level of political institutions, and when we move to this question of what is it that citizens actually do. And not everyone, by the way, is a citizen. There are people who are subjects. There's a difference between being a citizen and being a subject, right? But citizens will obviously then have to think about what are their particular duties and responsibilities. Then there is the question, which is a question of interiority. That is, looking for the fascist within ourselves. And one of the most interesting things, you might find this a very odd way to sort of answer the question, the anecdote that I'm going to relate. I'm going to relate a very short anecdote from Gandhi's life. And that anecdote is that this is in the 1930s. It's related by Kaka Kalelkar, who points out that once Gandhi was, you know, sitting and, you know, he would confer darshan. So people would stand in line for a very long period of time. So there was this grandmother who had been standing in line with her grandson, and the grandson is about 4 or 5 years old. She's been standing in line for an hour. Finally, her turn comes and she's before Gandhi, and she says, Gandhi says, what can I do for you? And she says, Bapuji, there is a bit of a problem. The problem is that my grandson, you know, he eats too many sweets all the time, and he doesn't listen to me. I've been telling him you shouldn't eat so many sweets because it's going to ruin your teeth, right? And she says, I think if you say it to him, after all, you are the Mahatma, right? He'll listen. So all Gandhi says to her is, come back to me in a month's time. So a month later, she shows up again in line. Then finally her turn comes, and then Gandhi says to the little boy, you know, he opens his mouth and he says, look at my teeth. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't stop eating sweets. And the boy says, Mahatma ji, thank you very much, etc. Then the woman says to Gandhi, but you could have said the same thing to him a month ago. And he says, yeah, but the problem is a month ago, I was eating too many sweets. For the last 1 month, I haven't eaten any sweets. Now, the point here simply is this, that you do not subject others to a test that you do not first subject yourself to. Gandhi, in that sense, that was the genius of Gandhi, never to instrumentalize another person. And that, it seems to me, is the beginning of an anti-fascist politics, that insight.
Thank you, Vinay.
See, Vinay has made two very important points. One is about the fascists within us. Gandhi always said, "Har koi apne ko dekhe." So this is a very important point which Vinay is making. And about this question of duties. See, it's one thing for someone to say, this is your duty, do this. The other is, ask yourself what your duty is. And do what you consider proper. Now, it is interesting, more than interesting, that Gandhi did not want fundamental rights. He was for fundamental duties, but not to be enforced by the state. For the first time, fundamental duties were introduced, were made part of the Indian Constitution. Do you remember when? During the emergency. It was Indira Gandhi who talked of fundamental duties and had them incorporated into the Indian Constitution. And it is not a coincidence that today again there is one leader in this country who is reminding people of their fundamental duties. So the same language, the same concept can mean radically different things, diametrically opposite things. So the point is not simply about duties, the point is also, are duties to be enforced? Or are duties something which we will think about, swadharma. So har koi apne ko dekhe, swadharma nibhaye.
Thank you, Sudhir. We don't have much time left, but I have one question for both of you. There's been a resurgence of interest in Gandhi. We have Ram here, biographies, and also as a response to the crisis in liberalism, a series of books trying to see him as this great mind that never fell for any of liberalism's charms. Now, what are the limitations of that kind of a comparative orientation to Gandhi? I mean, they've done a lot of fantastic things, but do you think that doesn't let us see other things in Gandhi? One. Second, is there a Gandhian perspective independently of its use value in illustrating something else's shortcomings? Is there a Dharampalish view on historical problems or problems in the present, or the future of Gandhian thought, if you will?
Yes, well, I think that there is actually, both are very large questions.
Yes,
but I think that if we had to take a Gandhian view, which not in the traditional sense of Gandhian, something that goes beyond, we'd have to think about the politics of knowledge. Because Gandhi is nothing if not also a way to enter into the politics of knowledge, to understand what are the limitations of the knowledge systems that we work with, particularly the knowledge system that we have inherited in India from the modern West, right? Without, of course, becoming nativist or in any sense of the term. I think we have to be very careful about that. But I think that Gandhi was seriously invested in a critique of certain aspects of Western modernity. Right? Hind Swaraj is such a fantastic work, partially because of that. So that would be one aspect of the question. But going back to your first question about the various isms and the fact that what is astonishingly rich about Gandhi is the fact that he's not subject to any of these trends. And he was as much a critic of Marxism and of constitutionalism and of liberalism as he was of many other political systems. And I think that I can only reiterate what I said earlier, that we have to think of him as a man who we can actually, the set of ideas he plays around with and the manner in which he plays around with them is just absolutely breathtaking. So we have to keep him in conversation by constantly reading him seriously and reading him not only for the insights, but even for something like humor. I mean, he was a man who really appreciated that, you know.